Hello and welcome back to the next video. My name is Gareth and you, I hope, are into royal history and consider yourself a geek, because if those things are correct, you are in the right place. If that's not you, stick around anyway, you never know, you might enjoy it. Okay, so today we are talking about Henry VIII and the almost constant speculation on social media that toward the end of his life he suffered from impotency and, as a result, performance issues in the bedroom. Now, I want to be clear, although I do not expect anything said in this video to be outlandish or vulgar, I am aware that we have some younger viewers, which is fantastic. You are very welcome. What I would just say is, if you are under 16 years of age, I would feel more comfortable if you just checked with mum or dad or granny or whoever you live with that they're relaxed about you watching this video. I think they will be absolutely fine with it, but it might be worth them just casting an eye over it just to check that for themselves. So please do that before carrying on, and I will obviously have to trust you because I will never know, for I am the other side of the screen. Okay, there's been a lot of speculation, particularly recently, although I think for many years, that toward the end of his life Henry suffered with a number of health issues. He, as we know, was very obese, he had a pretty bad diet, and as a result people speculated he may have suffered from type 2 diabetes and or high blood pressure. Both of these two things could have meant Henry was also vulnerable to impotency or some form of sexual performance issue. And sometimes when you read posts on social media or you enter into conversations, it's treated as a near certainty that he was. I think we have to be a little bit careful about that. It's very hard to diagnose from a distance of 500 years. I think it is true to say that some of the known facts we do know about Henry's medical records, including the fact that the ulcer in his leg seemed to take a very long time to ever heal and perhaps never really healed very effectively, could be indicative of the conditions that we were talking about earlier, but we must be cautious when diagnosing people from the past, particularly when we're talking about conditions that they were not aware of. However, on the issue of Henry's impotency, there is some source material that is worth considering, and I want to just take a few minutes to consider those two pieces of evidence that is worth us having a discussion about. The first comes from the year 1536 and the trial of George Boleyn, brother to Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated second queen of Henry VIII. As many of you will know, George was framed for having committed incest with his sister Anne, which would therefore be adultery and therefore treason against the king, and was put on trial for it. According to Chapeus, who was the imperial ambassador, when he was writing about these events and reporting them back to the emperor, his boss, he said that during the trial, George Boleyn was handed a document, a piece of paper, with some charges against him that he was told to read to himself, but not to read out loud. George, however, either out of a misunderstanding, or perhaps because he was making a stand and knew what was coming and wanted to go down with a bit of a fight, decided to read them out loud, to the shock of those assembled, because one of the charges was that George and his sister Anne had been overheard joking indiscreetly about the issues the king had pleasing a woman in the bedroom. For a number of reasons, we have to be a little bit cautious of this. Chapeus, who wrote about it, and it's through Chapeus it comes down to us, was not an eyewitness at the trial. He would have heard it from a number of different people who had been there, but we also know that Chapeus was not above reporting back things that were gossip as fact to his master. That said, he is complimentary about George Boleyn in the trial. He says George acquitted himself incredibly well. That is not something particularly that Chapais would have wanted to have said. He was not someone who would have been sympathetic to any of the Boleyns who he deemed the enemy. It's not particularly something the emperor wanted to hear, so it probably is being said purely because Chapais believed it to be the case, and he would have been aware of the seriousness of the issues he was reporting back, although maybe he would have thought the emperor would have taken some satisfaction in hearing such things said against Henry VIII. And of course, even if Chapais believed it, that doesn't mean that it was true. We know that the charges against George and Anne were largely manufactured. There's no reason this couldn't have been manufactured as well. But something about what we know of Anne and George's personality makes the story believable. Now, that's not hard and fast historical source criticism, but it perhaps gives us reason enough not to dismiss it out of hand. The second piece of evidence comes from 4 years later, in 1540, where, after Henry has spent his first disastrous night with his new bride, Anna of Cleves, he reports to his physician that he has been unable to fulfil his part of the marital bargain. The marriage has remained unconsummated, and Henry couldn't do it. Now, Henry is very clear that this is not his fault. He says it's because of faults with Anne. She is so unattractive to him in terms of her appearance, her body, her hygiene. He was unable to do the deed, and furthermore, he stresses to his doctor that he has had nocturnal activity. Basically, he's had wet dreams, suggesting there's no problem whatsoever with his kit, but it was his partner in the bedroom that left him unable to do what he would have been expected to have done. There's two ways we can take this piece of evidence. One is that Henry was so repulsed by being unable to do what he was normally able to do that he took it straight to the doctor and wanted to have this properly documented and investigated. The other is that he was so humiliated that his problem with impotency was becoming worse, that he was worried it would get out the marriage had not been consummated, and that attention would be drawn to him and his lack of ability in the bedroom, and he was therefore making it very clear that it was on record straight away that it wasn't his fault. It was a preemptive strike. Clearly, whatever the truth of either of these sources, we know that after the Anne Boleyn incident in 1536 that Henry still possessed enough ability to get his third wife, Jane Seymour, pregnant. If Edward VI, the future Edward VI, was Jane's first pregnancy, then it did take about 6 months to get Jane pregnant, which could again suggest some performance issues. However, it's entirely possible that Jane was pregnant beforehand and may have miscarried once before the future Edward VI. We just don't know that, but it's certainly possible. I won't go into the reasons now as to why that's the case. That's perhaps a conversation for another time. So that's it. Those are the only real potential pieces of source material we have to scrutinise. Of course, there's circumstantial evidence that should be factored in as well. Henry did not have any children with his last two wives, Catherine Howard or Catherine Parr, and he was married to both of them for a significant enough amount of time for that perhaps to have been a reasonable expectation. Catherine Parr, his last wife, although she'd had no children before Henry, the second that she was married to Thomas Seymour, who she married after Henry's death, who was the first time that she'd had a young, virile husband, she actually fell pregnant more or less immediately. So it's unlikely to have been any problem with her, which could suggest the issues are Henry. As a younger man, Henry had been pretty fertile. He claimed responsibility for 11 pregnancies, and he was almost certainly responsible for other pregnancies that he did not claim responsibility for. So the fact he doesn't seem to have got either of those wives pregnant could suggest that there was a barrier to actual sexual contact and regular sexual performance from Henry. However, you could also see it as declining fertility. Yes, today we often say that men can carry on siring children into their 80s, but I think many would recognise that fertility can decrease as a man gets older, and that could simply be what's happening with Henry, or of course it could be a combination of the two. For what it's worth, I wonder if the emotional side and the psychological side of Henry's life could have been a factor. Doctors today would tell us that psychological issues can be a barrier to male sexual performance and can cause intimacy. Henry had changed heaven and earth, almost literally, moved heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn. He'd had a relatively traumatic separation from his first wife, he'd become estranged from his daughter, who he'd once loved greatly, and he'd remade the political and religious map of England by declaring himself head of the church and breaking with Rome in order to have Anne. Almost straight away he found Anne to be a disappointment in his eyes. The psychological turmoil of that could well have led him experiencing some sexual intimacy issues, which of course could have added to his view that Anne had in some way bewitched him, or that there was something sinister about her character. These may have got progressively worse. The Cleves marriage may have been another time when we saw that, and it may have meant he was less sexually virile in his later years than he had been in his early ones. We simply don't know. All I would say as I leave is that I think we need to be cautious about making hard and fast diagnosis at this distance. And when we discuss these things on social media, let's just do so with a degree of humility, knowing that we can't really know exactly what the truth of the situation is. That's it from me today. Please do join the conversation on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, or on the blog itself, or here on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. Let's talk again soon, and I'll be back with another video.